The glass shattered against the marble floor before anyone could stop it, and the entire dining room went silent. Adrian Kane stood at the head of the table, his jaw tight, his hand still raised from where he had knocked the wine glass off the edge without meaning to. 12 guests sat frozen around him, forks halfway to their mouths, eyes darting between Adrian and the woman seated to his right. Her name was Charlotte Reyes. She wore a red dress that matched her lipstick and a smile that had not faltered once during the entire dinner, even as Adrian had answered every one of her questions with as few words as possible. "I think," Margaret Kane said from the far end of the table, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "that my grandson has something he wants to say." Adrian looked at his grandmother, 81 years old, spine straight as a rod, eyes sharp enough to see through steel. She had built half of what the Kane family owned with her own hands, and she had spent the last 3 years trying to marry him off to whichever woman she believed could carry the weight of that legacy. This was the 12th dinner, the 12th woman. The 12th carefully arranged evening meant to end with a proposal, or at least the promise of one. "I'm not doing this again," Adrian said quietly. Charlotte's smile finally cracked. "Excuse me? It's nothing personal." He folded his napkin and set it on the table, his movements slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he is trying not to make things worse. "You seem like a lovely person, but I am not going to sit here and pretend that a dinner arranged by my grandmother is the same thing as knowing someone." "Adrian," Margaret's voice was low now, dangerous, "sit down." "I'm 32 years old," he said, still standing. "I have said no 11 times before tonight. At what point does anyone in this family consider that I might actually mean it?" The room stayed silent. Somewhere down the table, his cousin Nathaniel Cole leaned back in his chair with the faintest smile on his lips, the kind of smile a man wears when he is watching someone else's mistake unfold exactly the way he hoped it would. "You are the head of this family's future," Margaret said. "Whether you accept that responsibility gracefully or not, it does not change. A man in your position does not have the luxury of choosing love like some ordinary person off the street. You marry well, you marry wisely, and the rest can come later, if it comes at all." "That's not a marriage," Adrian said. "That's a merger." Charlotte stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't need to sit here and listen to this." "Charlotte, please," Margaret began, but the younger woman was already walking toward the door, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, every guest in the room watching her leave with the kind of fascinated horror people reserve for car accidents. Adrian did not go after her. He knew he should have. He knew that in an hour his grandmother would remind him, in that voice she used when she was too angry to raise it, that he had humiliated a guest in his own home, and that there would be consequences to face. But right now, all he wanted was to be anywhere else. He walked out of the dining room without another word, ignoring the eyes that followed him, ignoring Nathaniel's low chuckle, ignoring even his grandmother calling his name behind him. The Kane estate was enormous, a sprawling stone house that had belonged to the family for 4 generations, with wings that branched off in every direction, and hallways that seemed to multiply the further one walked. Adrian moved through them without thinking, his feet carrying him along a path they had walked 1,000 times before, until he found himself standing in front of a door he had not opened in years. The old library. It had been his grandfather's favorite room once, before he passed, filled with towering shelves of leather-bound books and a smell of dust and old paper that Adrian remembered from childhood. After his grandfather died, the room had been mostly forgotten, locked away like a memory nobody wanted to disturb. He pushed the door open, expecting silence and darkness. Instead, he found light. A single lamp burned near the back of the room, casting a warm glow over rows of books that had been pulled from the shelves and stacked in careful, organized piles on a long wooden table. And sitting in the middle of it all, hunched over an open ledger with a pencil tucked behind her ear, was a woman he had never seen before in his life. She looked up at the sound of the door, startled, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She had dark hair pulled back loosely, strands falling around her face, and there was a smudge of dust across one cheek that she clearly did not know was there. Her clothes were simple, practical, nothing like the dresses that filled his grandmother's dinner parties. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has interrupted their work, not the way people usually looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said, closing the ledger. "I didn't think anyone came in here. I can leave, if you need the room." "No," Adrian said too quickly. "No, it's fine. Who are you?" "Elena." She hesitated, as if deciding how much to say. "Elena Voss. I've been hired to catalog and restore the archive. Books, letters, family records. Mrs. Kane brought me on a few weeks ago." Adrian frowned. His grandmother had not mentioned hiring anyone, but then again, his grandmother rarely mentioned anything unless she wanted something from it. I didn't know this room was still being used for anything. It wasn't, until recently. Elena glanced around at the stacks of books surrounding her, at the shelves half emptied, at the papers spread across the table like the pieces of a puzzle only she understood. There's a lot of history in here that nobody's touched in a long time. You're not from around here, Adrian said, though he wasn't sure how he knew that. Something in the way she spoke, careful and measured, like a person who chose her words rather than simply letting them fall out. Does it matter? The question caught him off guard. Nobody spoke to him like that. Nobody in his world answered a simple question with a question, as if they weren't the slightest bit interested in impressing him. No, he admitted. I suppose it doesn't. He should have left. There was a small, insistent voice in the back of his mind, reminding him that his grandmother was still furious downstairs, that Charlotte Reyes had probably already called her family to complain about the disaster of a dinner, that Nathaniel was likely spreading the story to anyone who would listen. But he found himself crossing the room instead, drawn toward the table full of old papers, the way a person is drawn toward something they cannot explain. What are you working on? He asked, nodding at the ledger. Letters, mostly. Some financial records from the 1800s. A few things that look like they were never meant to be found. She said the last part carefully, watching his face as if gauging his reaction. Should I be worried? For the first time, the corner of her mouth lifted, just slightly. Every family has things they'd rather forget, Mr. Kane. You know who I am. Everyone in this house knows who you are. It's a little hard to miss given the shouting downstairs. Adrian felt heat rise in his face, though he wasn't sure if it was embarrassment or something else entirely. You heard that. The whole East Wing probably heard that. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, the first easy sound he had made all evening. It wasn't my finest moment. No, Elena agreed. But it also wasn't the worst thing I've heard in this house. She turned back to her ledger, flipping it open again, dismissing him with the casual ease of someone who had never once cared about impressing a man like him. If you'll excuse me, I have a lot of work left tonight. He should have taken the hint. He should have walked out, gone to find his grandmother, smoothed over what could be smoothed over, and let the rest fall where it may. Instead, he pulled out a chair across the table from her and sat down. Elena looked up, one eyebrow raised. Can I help you with something else? I like it in here, he said simply. It's quiet. It's a library. That's generally the point. You know what I mean. She studied him for a long moment, long enough that he began to wonder what she was looking for, what conclusion she was reaching about him in the silence. Whatever it was, she didn't share it. She simply nodded once, almost to herself, and slid a stack of unsorted letters across the table toward him. If you're going to sit there, she said, you might as well be useful. Sort these by date, oldest first. Adrian looked down at the letters, then back up at her, something unfamiliar rising in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to curiosity, and beneath that, something closer to relief. For the first time in longer than he could remember, nobody wanted anything from him except help sorting old letters. And somehow, that was enough to make him want to stay. Outside the library, the house buzzed with whispers about the dinner, about Charlotte's dramatic exit, about what Margaret Kane would do next to force her grandson into line. But inside that quiet room, surrounded by dust and candlelight and the careful, unbothered presence of a woman who didn't seem to want anything from him at all, Adrian Kane picked up the first letter from the stack and began to read. He did not know, not yet, that he had just stepped into the one room in the entire estate his grandmother had never meant for him to find. He did not know what secrets were buried in the pages stacked across that table. Secrets that stretched back further than either of them realized, tangled together with the very woman now sitting across from him. All he knew was that for the first time in years, he did not want to leave. The knock on the library door came just after 10 the next morning, sharp and impatient, and Elena knew before she even looked up who it would be. It's open, she called, not glancing away from the stack of brittle papers in front of her. Adrian stepped inside, dressed differently than he had been the night before, more casual, sleeves rolled to his elbows as if he had come prepared to actually work. He held 2 cups of coffee, one of which he set down carefully beside her without asking whether she wanted it. I wasn't sure how you take it, he said, so I brought cream and sugar separately. Elena looked at the cup, then at him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she caught it and smoothed it away. You didn't have to do that. I know. He pulled out the same chair from the night before and sat down across from her, as if this had already become a routine rather than something that had happened exactly once. I wanted to see if the letters made any more sense in daylight. They don't, Elena said. Most of them are just household accounts. Purchases, repairs, wages paid to staff. Nothing exciting. Then what were the ones from last night? The ones you said were never meant to be found? She hesitated, and Adrian noticed it, the way her hand paused for just a fraction of a second over the papers before continuing. It was such a small thing that most people would have missed it entirely. He did not. Personal correspondence, she said finally. Letters between family members. Nothing that concerns you specifically. Everything in this house concerns me eventually, Adrian said, though he kept his tone light, careful not to push too hard. But I won't pry if you'd rather not say. Elena glanced at him, something unreadable in her expression, before returning to her work. Thank you. They fell into an easy silence after that, Adrian sorting through the stack of letters she had given him the night before, Elena cataloging entries into her ledger with quick, practiced strokes. It was strange, he thought, how comfortable the silence felt. Every other room in this house demanded something from him: conversation, performance, the careful management of expectations. This room asked for nothing except his attention to the task in front of him. How long have you been doing this kind of work? He asked eventually. Archival restoration? About 6 years. And before that? Elena's pencil paused again, just barely. Before that, I did something else. You're very good at answering questions without actually answering them. It's a skill, she said, and there was the faintest hint of humor in her voice now, enough to make Adrian smile despite himself. Fair enough, he said. I won't push. You say that a lot for someone who keeps asking questions. He laughed, a genuine sound this time, low and surprised, as if he hadn't expected to laugh at all that morning. I suppose I do. The door opened again before either of them could say more, and Priya Malhotra stepped inside, a stack of clean linens balanced against one hip, her dark eyes taking in the scene with obvious curiosity. She was the estate's housekeeper, had been for almost a decade, and she had a way of noticing things that most people preferred to keep hidden. There you are, Priya said to Elena, though her gaze slid meaningfully toward Adrian. Your grandmother is looking for you, Mr. Kane. She does not seem happy. She rarely does, Adrian said, standing reluctantly. She's in the study. I'd hurry, if I were you. Adrian glanced back at Elena, who had already returned her attention to the ledger, giving no indication that she cared one way or another, whether he stayed or left. I'll come back later, he said, if that's all right. Elena looked up briefly. It's your library. It wasn't quite a yes, but it wasn't a no either, and Adrian found himself holding on to that small, ambiguous permission as he made his way through the halls toward his grandmother's study. Margaret was seated behind her desk when he entered, a stack of correspondence in front of her, reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She did not look up immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to remind him who was in control of the conversation. Charlotte's family called this morning, she said finally, setting down her pen. They are, understandably, quite upset. I imagine they are. This is the 12th time, Adrian. Margaret removed her glasses, fixing him with a look that had made grown men in boardrooms shrink back into their chairs. 12th. Do you understand what that does to this family's reputation? Do you understand what people say about a man who cannot commit to anything, who embarrasses guest after guest in his own home? I understand that none of these women were people I chose, Adrian said. They were choices you made for me. Because someone has to think about the future of this family, and it certainly isn't going to be you if you keep behaving like a petulant child. The words stung more than he wanted them to, and he forced himself to keep his voice steady. I am 32 years old. I run half of this family's business already. I think I've earned the right to choose who I spend my life with. Margaret studied him for a long moment, something calculating in her gaze, the same look she wore when negotiating a deal she did not intend to lose. Fine, she said finally. Choose someone yourself then. Prove to me you can. But I want a name within the month, Adrian, someone suitable, someone who understands what it means to stand beside this family. If you cannot manage that, I will make the choice for you, and you will not enjoy the result. A month, Adrian repeated. A month, Margaret confirmed. Now if you'll excuse me, I have calls to make to smooth over the mess from last night. Adrian left the study with his jaw tight and his mind racing, the weight of his grandmother's ultimatum settling heavily across his shoulders. A month to find someone, to prove himself capable of choosing his own future, or she would take that choice away from him entirely. He did not go back to the library right away. Instead, he walked the grounds for nearly an hour, turning the conversation over in his mind. trying to imagine which of the women his grandmother might approve of, trying and failing to picture himself standing at an altar beside any of them. It was late afternoon by the time he found his way back to the library, and when he stepped inside, he found Elena exactly where he had left her, though the light outside the windows had shifted, casting long shadows across the stacks of books. "You look troubled," she said, not looking up from her work. "Family business." "Ah." She said nothing else, giving him space rather than pushing for details, and he found himself grateful for that more than he could easily explain. He sat down across from her again, picking up where he had left off with the letters, and for a while neither of them spoke. It was Elena who finally broke the silence, sliding a folded piece of paper across the table toward him. "I found this in one of the boxes from the East Wing," she said. "It's addressed to a Kane, but I can't quite place which one. Perhaps you'd know the name." Adrian unfolded the paper carefully, scanning the faded handwriting. It was a short note, formal in tone, referencing a debt owed and a family disgraced, though the details were vague enough to be meaningless without more context. At the bottom, a single name was signed in careful script. Voss. He looked up at Elena, and for just a moment, something flickered across her face, gone so quickly he almost thought he had imagined it. Fear, perhaps. Or something closer to recognition. "Elena," he said slowly, "is this?" "It's probably nothing," she said, taking the paper back from him and setting it aside without looking at it again. "A common enough name. I wouldn't read too much into it." But her hands, he noticed, were not quite steady as she reached for the next stack of letters, and Adrian found himself wondering, not for the first time, exactly what secrets this quiet, careful woman was working so hard to keep buried. Nathaniel Cole poured himself a drink he did not need and watched the city lights flicker beyond the window of his apartment, turning a single thought over and over in his mind like a coin he could not stop flipping. Adrian had a month. He had heard it from one of the staff, who had heard it from someone else, the way information always traveled through the Kane estate faster than anyone intended. A month to find a bride, or Margaret would choose one herself, and either way, the wedding would happen, the succession would be secured, and Nathaniel's own path toward control of the family business would close a little further with every passing day. He had spent his entire life standing one step behind Adrian. Same schools, same expectations, always the backup, always the spare heir waiting in the wings in case the golden grandson ever failed to live up to expectations. For years, Nathaniel had told himself that his patience would eventually be rewarded, that Margaret would see his loyalty and his competence and choose him instead. She never had. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had used only twice before, a man named Edmund Cross who sat on the board of the family's shipping division and who had made no secret of his frustration with what he called Adrian's reckless modernization of the company. "Edmund," Nathaniel said when the call connected, "I think it's time we talked again." "About the board vote?" "About all of it." Nathaniel swirled the drink in his hand, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "Adrian's about to make a decision that could destabilize the entire family. I think there might be an opportunity in that, for both of us, if we're patient." There was a pause on the other end of the line, calculating, the same kind of silence Margaret so often used to unsettle people. "I'm listening." Meanwhile, across the estate, Adrian had found himself returning to the library more often than he could reasonably justify. What had started as an accident, a place to hide from an uncomfortable dinner, had become something closer to a habit, then closer still to something he did not want to examine too carefully. "You're here early," Elena said, when he arrived the next morning to find her already surrounded by open boxes, sorting through what looked like decades of unopened correspondence. "I couldn't sleep." "Neither could I." She gestured at the boxes around her. "Your grandmother wants the family archive fully cataloged before the end of the season. Apparently there's some kind of anniversary event being planned, and she wants the family history on display." Adrian sat down across from her, the routine familiar now, comfortable in a way that surprised him every time he noticed it. "Anything more about that letter, the one with the Voss name?" Elena's expression shuddered slightly, the openness from the day before retreating behind something more guarded. "I haven't found anything else related to it." "You know I don't believe you." "You don't have to believe me, you just have to leave it alone." Her voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it, and Adrian recognized it as the tone of someone who had learned, through hard experience, how to protect the parts of herself she did not want examined. "Fair enough," he said, though the curiosity did not leave him, simply settled somewhere in the back of his mind to wait. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, and Adrian found himself watching her more than he was reading the letters in front of him, the careful way she handled each fragile page, the small furrow that appeared between her eyebrows when she came across something that puzzled her, the quiet hum she sometimes made without seeming to notice she was doing it. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. "You're going to ask regardless of what I say." "Probably." He smiled, and she rolled her eyes, though there was no real irritation behind it. "Why did you take this job? An estate like this, hidden away in the countryside, cataloging papers nobody's looked at in decades. It seems like a strange choice for someone your age." Elena considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I wanted somewhere quiet," she said finally. "Somewhere nobody knew my name, or my history, or expected anything from me except good work. This job offered that." "And does it offer that, I mean?" "It did," she said, glancing up at him with something that might have been humor, or might have been warning, until the head of the household started showing up every day wanting to talk. Adrian laughed, low and genuine. "Am I bothering you?" "You're a distraction," she admitted, "but not an unwelcome one." The admission hung in the air between them, small but significant, and Adrian felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door opening, and both of them looked up to find Charlotte Reyes standing in the entrance, her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. "So this is where you've been disappearing to," she said, her eyes moving between Adrian and Elena with obvious calculation. "Charlotte." Adrian stood quickly, an uncomfortable formality settling over him. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Clearly." Charlotte stepped further into the room, her gaze lingering on Elena for a beat too long. "Your grandmother invited me back for tea this afternoon. She seems to think there might still be a chance to repair things between us, given the circumstances." "I see. Who's this?" Charlotte asked, nodding toward Elena, her tone polite but with an edge underneath it that Elena recognized instantly, the particular kind of politeness women used when they were assessing a threat. "Elena Voss," Elena said before Adrian could answer. "I'm cataloging the family archive." "How interesting." Charlotte's smile did not reach her eyes. "And you spend a lot of time here, Adrian? With the archivist?" "I like this room," Adrian said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "It's quiet." "I'm sure it is." Charlotte's gaze flicked once more to Elena before settling back on Adrian. "Your grandmother is expecting you at tea as well. She said it was important." "I'll be there," Adrian said. Charlotte turned to leave, pausing at the door to glance back at the two of them one more time, something calculating in her expression that made Elena's stomach tighten with unease, though she could not have said exactly why. Once the door closed behind her, Elena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "She doesn't like me." "She doesn't know you," Adrian said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Elena began gathering the loose papers on the table, her movements suddenly brisk, businesslike. "You should go. Your grandmother is waiting." "Elena." "It's fine, Adrian." She did not look up at him. "This is your world. I understand that. I'm just passing through it." The words settled uncomfortably in his chest as he made his way toward the door, and he found himself pausing there, looking back at her one more time. "I don't think that's true," he said quietly. "I don't think you're just passing through anything." He left before she could respond, and Elena sat alone in the library for a long while afterward, staring at the closed door, her heart beating a little too fast for a woman who had told herself, over and over, that she had no business feeling anything at all for a man like Adrian Kane. That evening, tea with Margaret and Charlotte stretched into an uncomfortable hour of careful conversation and pointed questions, Margaret watching her grandson with the sharp, assessing eyes of a woman who missed nothing. When Charlotte finally excused herself, claiming a headache, Margaret waited until the door closed before turning her full attention on Adrian. "You've been spending a great deal of time in the old library," she said. "There's work being done there. I'm interested in the family history." "Are you?" Margaret's tone made it clear she did not believe him, not entirely. "The girl you hired to catalog the archive. Voss, was it?" Adrian's stomach tightened at the mention of the name, though he kept his expression neutral. "I didn't hire her, you did. On the recommendation of an old associate. I never met her personally." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Perhaps I should remedy that. There's no need to trouble yourself over an archivist, grandmother." "There is every need," Margaret said, standing slowly, her cane tapping once against the floor as she rose. "When my grandson starts disappearing into a locked room with a woman I know nothing about, instead of pursuing the marriage I have given him a month to secure, I find myself very interested indeed." She left the room without another word, and Adrian stood alone in the quiet aftermath, dread settling low and heavy in his chest, the growing certainty that whatever careful peace he had built in that library, it would not survive much longer under his grandmother's scrutiny. The library door burst open with enough force to send a stack of papers sliding off the edge of the table, and Elena looked up to find Charlotte standing in the doorway, her face flushed, her eyes bright with something that looked dangerously close to triumph. "I knew it," Charlotte said, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger. "I knew there was something going on between you two." Adrian, who had been leaning over the table beside Elena, straightened quickly, though the movement did little to erase what Charlotte had clearly already seen, the closeness between them, the easy familiarity that no amount of explanation could fully undo. "Charlotte, this isn't what it looks like," Adrian started. "Don't." Charlotte held up a hand, her voice sharp. "Don't insult me by pretending I'm blind. I've been watching you disappear into this room for weeks. Everyone has noticed. The staff talk, Adrian. Did you think I wouldn't hear about it eventually?" Elena stood slowly, her spine straight, refusing to let the panic rising in her chest show on her face. "Nothing has happened here that anyone needs to be ashamed of." "I'm not talking to you," Charlotte snapped, before turning back to Adrian. "Your grandmother deserves to know exactly what her precious grandson has been doing, instead of honoring the commitment he made to this family." "Charlotte, please." Adrian took a step forward, but she was already moving toward the door. "She's in the study," Charlotte said, without looking back. "I suggest you get there before I do, though I doubt it will help you." The door slammed shut behind her, and for a moment, neither Adrian nor Elena moved, the silence in the library heavy with the weight of what was coming. "Adrian," Elena said quietly, "you should go after her. Explain." "There's nothing to explain," Adrian said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "I haven't done anything wrong. You know that isn't how your grandmother will see it." Elena began gathering her things with quick, efficient movements, her hands betraying the calm she was trying to project. "I think it's best if I finish my work quietly and let this pass on its own." "Elena. Please, Adrian, just let me handle this my way." But there was no handling it. Not once Charlotte reached Margaret's study, and by the time Adrian arrived, breathless and dreading what he would find, his grandmother was already seated behind her desk with a thin folder open in front of her, her expression unreadable in a way that frightened him more than any anger could have. "Sit down," Margaret said without looking up. "Grandmother, whatever Charlotte told you." "I did not need Charlotte to tell me anything," Margaret interrupted. "I made a few calls of my own, after our conversation the other evening. It's remarkable what a name and a little persistence can uncover." She finally looked up, and the coldness in her eyes made Adrian's stomach drop. "Voss. Elena Voss. Does that name mean anything to you beyond the woman in your library? Should it?" Margaret slid the folder across the desk toward him. Inside were old newspaper clippings, financial documents, a photograph of a man Adrian did not recognize standing beside a much younger Margaret at some formal event decades earlier. "Her father," Margaret said, "was Edward Voss. A business partner of your grandfather's many years ago, before he was accused of embezzling funds from this family and disgraced publicly. The scandal ruined him. He died a few years later, and his family scattered, changed their lives entirely to escape the name." Adrian stared at the photograph, his mind racing to reconcile the careful, guarded woman he had come to know with the daughter of a man his own family had apparently destroyed. Elena knew about this. "Of course she knew," Margaret said. "She has spent the last several weeks in this house under a false pretense, working her way into your confidence, into this family's private archive no less. Did you ever stop to wonder, Adrian, why a woman with her particular history would seek employment here of all places?" "You think she's here for revenge?" "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that I do not know what she is here for, and neither, apparently, do you, which is precisely the problem." Adrian closed the folder, his hands unsteady. "This doesn't change who she is. I know her, grandmother. I've spent weeks with her." "You've spent weeks with a version of her that she chose to show you," Margaret said. "That is not the same thing as knowing someone." She stood, moving toward the window, her back to him. "I have already spoken with the agency that placed her. Her employment here is terminated, effective immediately. She will be gone by this evening. You can't do that." "I can, and I have." Margaret turned back to face him, and for a moment, something almost like sympathy crossed her features, before hardening again into resolve. "I am protecting this family, Adrian, from a scandal that nearly destroyed us once before. I would think, given everything I have sacrificed for this family's name, that you might trust my judgment in this." Adrian did not wait to hear more. He left the study at a near run, his heart pounding, dread pooling low in his stomach as he made his way back toward the library, praying he was not already too late. He was. The library was empty when he arrived, the table cleared of its usual stacks of papers, the ledger gone from its place beside the lamp. A single note sat on the table where Elena usually worked, folded once, his name written across the front in careful handwriting. His hands shook as he opened it. Adrian, by the time you read this, I will already be gone. I should have told you the truth about my father from the beginning, and I am sorry that I did not. I told myself it did not matter, that the past was the past, but I think I always knew it would come out eventually, one way or another. I did not come here for revenge. I want you to know that, even if you have no reason to believe me now, I came here because this job offered quiet and distance and a chance to work somewhere no one knew my history. I did not expect to find you in this library that first night. I certainly did not expect any of what came after. Please don't try to find me. It will only make things harder for both of us, and your grandmother is not wrong to want to protect this family. I understand that, even if it hurts more than I expected it to. Take care of yourself, Adrian. Elena. Adrian read the note twice, then a third time, before crumpling it in his fist, anger and grief tangling together in his chest, until he could barely tell one from the other. Outside the library window, the sun was setting over the estate grounds, painting everything in shades of orange and gray, and somewhere out there, Elena Voss was already gone, carrying with her the truth he had only just begun to understand. He thought of his grandmother's words, of duty and legacy, and the weight of the family name, and for the first time in his life, he found himself questioning whether any of it was worth what it had just cost him. Down the hallway, unseen by anyone, Nathaniel Cole watched the chaos unfold with quiet satisfaction, already reaching for his phone to make the call that would set the next phase of his plan into motion. Adrian did not sleep that night, and by morning, he had made a decision that surprised even himself. He walked into his grandmother's study without knocking, the crumpled note from Elena still folded in his jacket pocket, and found Margaret already awake, seated behind her desk with a cup of tea untouched beside her. I need to know where she went, he said, without preamble. Margaret looked up slowly. Adrian, you had her investigated. You must have an address, a contact, something. I do not think that would be wise. I don't care what you think is wise. His voice was steadier than he expected, firmer than he had ever spoken to his grandmother before. You made a decision about my life without asking me, again, the same way you have every single time, and I am done letting you do that. Margaret set down her pen, studying him with an expression he could not quite read. You barely know this woman. I know her better than I've known any of the 12 women you paraded through this house, Adrian said. I know that she works with more care and honesty than anyone I've met in this family in years. I know that when she looks at me, she isn't calculating what she can gain from the Kane name, and I know that whatever her father did or didn't do decades ago, it has nothing to do with who she is. And if you're wrong, then I'll be wrong. But it will be my mistake to make, not yours. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tapping once against the surface of her desk, a habit Adrian recognized from years of watching her negotiate. Finally, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder, setting it on the desk between them. There's an address, she said. A small apartment, the last one listed with the agency that placed her here. I cannot promise it's current. Adrian took the folder without another word, already turning toward the door. Adrian. His grandmother's voice stopped him at the threshold. Before you go rushing off after this woman, there is something else you should know. Something I only learned last night, after I had already set things in motion. He turned back, something in her tone making the hair on his arms rise. What is it? Margaret's expression, for once, held something close to shame. I made calls to old associates, trying to confirm the details of the Voss scandal from all those years ago. What I found was not what I expected. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The embezzlement charges against Edward Voss were never fully substantiated. There were irregularities in the investigation, financial records that never quite added up, testimony that seemed coached. Your grandfather pushed the matter forward regardless, eager to protect the company's reputation at any cost. Adrian felt something cold settle in his chest. Are you saying he was innocent? I am saying, Margaret said carefully, that I do not know for certain, and neither, it seems, did your grandfather. But he ruined a man's life and reputation based on evidence that would not have survived real scrutiny, and this family has lived comfortably off the silence that followed ever since. She looked up at him, and for the first time in longer than Adrian could remember, his formidable grandmother looked uncertain. If that woman has spent her entire life carrying the weight of a scandal our family created unjustly, then I owe her considerably more than a hasty dismissal. Adrian did not know what to say to that, the revelation reshaping everything he thought he understood about the last several weeks. He thought of Elena's careful guardedness, the way she flinched at the mention of her father's name, the quiet dignity with which she had carried a burden that had never truly been hers to bear. "I'm going to find her," he said finally. "I know," Margaret said. "Go." He was nearly to the door when his phone rang, an unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. He answered it out of habit more than curiosity, and the voice on the other end made him freeze in place. "Adrian Kane," said a man he recognized as one of the senior board members from the shipping division, his tone clipped and businesslike. "I'm calling to inform you that an emergency board meeting has been called for this afternoon. There are concerns being raised about certain financial decisions made under your leadership over the past year. Your cousin Nathaniel has requested the meeting be convened immediately." Adrian's grip tightened around the phone. "On what grounds?" "That will be discussed at the meeting. I would strongly advise you to attend." The call ended, and Adrian stood frozen in the hallway, torn between two urgent pulls, the woman he needed to find, and the family business now apparently under attack from within by his own cousin. He thought of Nathaniel's quiet satisfaction over the years, the resentment he had always sensed but never fully understood, and realized with a sinking feeling that this had likely been building for far longer than he ever suspected. He made his choice quickly, decisively, in a way that surprised him. The business would still be there tomorrow. Elena might not be. He called his assistant, instructing her to attend the board meeting in his place with full authority to negotiate a delay, and then he left the estate without another word to anyone, driving faster than he probably should have toward the address his grandmother had given him. The apartment building was small, unremarkable, tucked into a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city that felt worlds away from the Kane estate's sprawling grounds. Adrian climbed the narrow stairwell 2 steps at a time, his heart pounding by the time he reached the 3rd floor, and found the door his grandmother's folder had indicated. He knocked, and for a long moment, nothing happened. He knocked again, harder, calling her name, and just as he was beginning to fear the address was outdated, the door opened. Elena stood in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed, clearly startled to find him standing there. "Adrian, what are you doing here? I need to talk to you." "There's nothing left to say. Your grandmother made herself very clear." "My grandmother was wrong," Adrian said, "about all of it. About your father, about you, about everything she assumed the moment Charlotte walked into her study with half a story." He stepped forward, close enough now to see the exhaustion etched into her features, the careful walls she had built around herself since childhood, still standing even now. "The charges against your father were never proven. My grandmother told me herself. He was likely innocent, ruined by an investigation my own grandfather pushed forward to protect this family's reputation." Elena's breath caught, her composure cracking for just a moment before she forced it back into place. "That doesn't change anything. It doesn't undo what happened to him, or to my mother, or to the years we spent rebuilding a life from nothing." "No," Adrian agreed quietly. "It doesn't, but it changes what happens next, if you'll let it." "Adrian, I'm not asking you to forgive my family," he said. "I'm not even asking you to come back to that house. I'm asking you not to disappear, not because of a mistake that was never yours to carry in the first place." Elena stared at him for a long moment, something fragile and uncertain flickering across her face, years of careful self-protection warring with something newer, something she had clearly not expected to feel again after everything her family had endured. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian did not hesitate. "Because for the first time in my entire life, someone looked at me and saw a person, instead of a name, attached to a fortune. Because in that library, surrounded by dusty letters and old secrets, I felt more like myself than I have in years. Because I am not walking away from that, Elena, not without a fight." The silence between them stretched, charged and uncertain, until Elena finally stepped back from the doorway, leaving just enough space for him to follow her inside. Behind them, unseen, Adrian's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, message after message piling up from his assistant, warnings about the board meeting spiraling rapidly out of control, about Nathaniel's growing support among the shareholders, about a vote that could strip Adrian of his authority within the family business entirely by the end of the day. He silenced the phone without looking at it. Whatever battle waited for him back at the estate, it would have to wait a little longer. By the time Adrian returned to the Kane estate the next morning, The board meeting had already concluded, and the news waiting for him was worse than he expected. Nathaniel had used Adrian's absence as evidence of his unreliability, painting a picture for the shareholders of a man too distracted by personal matters to be trusted with the company's future. A vote had been called to strip Adrian of his controlling authority over the shipping division, temporarily reassigning it to a committee that Nathaniel had quietly stacked with allies over the past several months. It was not a complete victory for his cousin, not yet, but it was close enough to send a clear message throughout the family and the business alike. Adrian found his grandmother in the study, papers spread across her desk, her expression grim as she reviewed the details his assistant had sent over that morning. "He's been planning this for longer than we realized," Margaret said without looking up. "Edmund Cross and several others on the board have apparently been meeting with him for weeks." "I know." Adrian sat down heavily across from her. "I should have seen it coming."
"You were distracted."
Margaret's tone held less judgment than he expected, perhaps understandably so. Elena stood quietly near the doorway, having followed Adrian back to the estate after a long conversation the night before that had left both of them raw but resolved. She had insisted on coming, despite Adrian's hesitation, telling him firmly that she was done letting other people's decisions dictate the shape of her life. Margaret looked up, noticing her for the first time, and for a long moment, the two women simply studied each other across the room. "Miss Voss," Margaret said finally, "I owe you an apology. A significant one, I think, given everything my family has cost yours." Elena's chin lifted slightly, old wariness still present in her posture, though something in her expression had softened. "Apologies don't undo what happened to my father." "No," Margaret agreed, "they don't. But I intend to make what amends I can, starting with a public correction of the record regarding the charges against him. I have already instructed our legal team to review the original investigation." Elena's composure cracked slightly at that, years of careful control giving way to something rawer underneath. "Why would you do that? It would be far easier for your family to simply let the past stay buried." "Because I am tired," Margaret said quietly, "of protecting a name at the expense of the people who deserved better from us. I have made that mistake enough times in my life, Miss Voss. I do not intend to make it again." The moment was interrupted by the study door opening, and Nathaniel stepped inside, his expression carrying none of the satisfaction Adrian expected, only a kind of tired defiance. "I heard you were back," Nathaniel said to Adrian. "Come to concede gracefully, I hope." "Sit down, Nathaniel," Margaret said, her voice carrying the particular chill that made even the most confident men in her orbit grow quiet. "We have things to discuss." "There's nothing to discuss. The vote was clear. The shareholders have spoken." "The shareholders were misled," Margaret said. "Edmund Cross has already called to inform me of your arrangement with him, once he realized precisely how thoroughly you intended to use him for your own ambitions rather than any genuine concern for this company's future. He is not a man who enjoys being managed, Nathaniel, and he does not appreciate discovering that he was." Nathaniel's confident expression faltered slightly. "That's not. I would be very careful about what you say next," Margaret continued, "because I am still deciding whether this family has room for a man who would rather tear his own cousin down than build something of his own." The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable, Nathaniel's carefully constructed plan crumbling in real time as the weight of his grandmother's disappointment settled over him. "I only wanted what I was promised," Nathaniel said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier bravado. "Years of being told I was just as capable, just as valuable, and then watching every opportunity go to Adrian regardless." Something in his voice made Adrian pause, an old resentment finally spoken aloud after years of simmering beneath the surface. "Nathaniel, if you had come to me, if you had simply told me you felt overlooked, we could have found a way forward together. This didn't have to happen like this." "Easy for you to say," Nathaniel said bitterly. "You've never had to ask for anything in your life." Margaret's voice cut through the tension before it could escalate further. "Nathaniel, you will step down from the shipping division's committee, effective immediately, and you will issue a formal apology to the board for misrepresenting the circumstances of the vote. Whether you remain part of this family's business beyond that will depend entirely on how you conduct yourself going forward. This is your last chance. I suggest you take it seriously." Nathaniel looked between his grandmother and his cousin, something in his expression finally breaking, years of resentment giving way to something closer to exhaustion. "Fine," he said quietly. "Fine. I'll make the apology." He left the room without another word, and Margaret let out a slow breath, the weight of the confrontation visible in the tired lines of her face. "Well," she said, "that is one crisis addressed, at least for now." Adrian turned to Elena, who had remained quiet throughout the entire exchange. watching the family drama unfold with careful, guarded eyes. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was softer than usual. "It's strange watching all of this. I spent so many years imagining your family as this untouchable, perfect institution. It's stranger still, seeing how much of it is held together by the same messy, complicated things as everyone else." "We're not so different from anyone else," Adrian said, despite what my grandmother's dinner parties might suggest. Margaret cleared her throat pointedly from behind her desk. "If the two of you are quite finished, I believe there is still the small matter of the ultimatum I gave you a month to resolve, Adrian." Adrian felt his stomach tighten, uncertain where this was heading. "Grandmother, I am not going to force you into another arranged dinner," Margaret said, something almost like amusement flickering across her face. "I think we have all learned rather thoroughly this month exactly how well that approach tends to work out. But I would like to know, given everything that has happened, whether you have found the answer you were looking for." Adrian looked at Elena, who met his gaze steadily, none of her earlier guardedness present now, only quiet, careful hope. "I have," Adrian said. Margaret studied the two of them for a long moment, and then, for the first time in longer than Adrian could remember, something that might have been genuine warmth crossed his grandmother's face. "Well then," she said, "I suppose we have a great deal to discuss, Miss Voss, if you intend to remain part of this family's future, starting perhaps with your father's name, and the correction it deserves." Elena's eyes shone with unshed tears, though her voice remained steady. "I would like that very much." Outside the study window, the late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the estate grounds, and for the first time since Adrian could remember, the house felt less like a stage for performance and obligation, and more like something closer to a home. The following weeks brought changes neither of them could have fully anticipated. Margaret's legal team confirmed what she had suspected, that Edward Voss had been the victim of a hastily conducted investigation designed to protect the Kane family's reputation, rather than uncover the truth. A formal statement was issued, restoring his name in the business community that had once shunned him, and Elena found herself, for the first time in years, able to speak of her father, without the weight of shame she had carried since childhood. Nathaniel, true to his word, issued his apology to the board, though the road toward rebuilding trust within the family remained a long one. Margaret, in a decision that surprised everyone including herself, offered him a genuine role within the company's expansion division, a chance to build something of his own rather than simply waiting for scraps of Adrian's inheritance. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was a start. And Adrian and Elena continued to spend their mornings in the old library, though the work had shifted from cataloging old letters to something quieter, gentler, the easy companionship of two people who had found, against every expectation, exactly what they had not known they were looking for. Snow fell quietly over the Kane estate on the morning of the wedding, dusting the gardens in a thin layer of white that caught the early light and turned the grounds into something almost unrecognizable, softer, gentler than the imposing house Elena remembered from her first anxious weeks there. She stood in front of the mirror in what had once been a guest room and was now simply hers, smoothing down the front of a simple, elegant dress that bore no resemblance to the elaborate gowns she imagined the Kane family might have once expected from a bride. It had been her choice, insisted upon despite Margaret's initial raised eyebrow, and in the end, Margaret had not argued. "You look beautiful," Priya said from the doorway, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Though I suppose I should have expected nothing less, given how much trouble you two caused this family to reach this point." Elena laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it had not been when she first arrived at the estate. "I don't think either of us intended to cause quite this much trouble. Trouble has a way of finding people who are worth the effort," Priya said, stepping into the room to adjust a stray strand of Elena's hair. "For what it's worth, I am glad it found you." A knock sounded at the door, and Margaret entered without waiting for a response, a small velvet box in her hands. She studied Elena for a long moment, something soft and unfamiliar in her expression, before crossing the room to stand beside her. "This belonged to my mother," Margaret said, opening the box to reveal a delicate necklace, simple and elegant, clearly old but beautifully preserved. "I wore it at my own wedding, many years ago. I would like you to wear it today, if you're willing." Elena's throat tightened. "Margaret, I couldn't." "You can, and you will," Margaret said, her tone brooking no argument, though there was warmth beneath the familiar sternness now, warmth that had grown steadily over the past several months as the two women moved past their difficult beginning toward something Elena had never expected to find, a genuine, if occasionally prickly affection. "You have shown my grandson more honesty and more patience than any of the women I once paraded through this house ever managed." You have earned the right to wear this family's history, Elena, not as a burden, but as a gift. Elena turned so Margaret could fasten the necklace around her neck, the cool metal settling against her collarbone like a quiet promise. Thank you, she said softly, for everything, for the apology, for my father's name, for all of it. Thank you, Margaret said, for showing my grandson that love does not have to be a merger to be worth pursuing. She stepped back, studying Elena one final time before nodding once, satisfied. Now, shall we not keep him waiting any longer? I believe he has waited quite long enough already. The ceremony took place in the gardens behind the estate, a small, intimate gathering rather than the grand society event Margaret might once have insisted upon. Adrian stood beneath an arch of winter greenery, and when Elena appeared at the far end of the garden path, snow still drifting gently around them, he felt the same quiet certainty he had felt that first night in the library, the sense that he had found something he had not even known he was searching for. Nathaniel stood among the small crowd of guests, his relationship with Adrian still cautious, still rebuilding, but present nonetheless, a small nod passing between the cousins as Elena made her way down the aisle. It was not everything, but it was enough, a foundation for something better than what had come before. The ceremony itself was brief, simple, exactly as both of them had wanted, free of the performance and obligation that had once defined every major event in Adrian's life. When he finally slipped the ring onto Elena's finger and pulled her close, he felt the last of his old uncertainty dissolve entirely, replaced by something steady and sure. I love you, he said quietly, just for her to hear. Not because of anything you can offer this family, or because my grandmother approves, just because of who you are. I love you too, Elena whispered back, even after everything this family put me through to get here. He laughed softly, resting his forehead against hers. We'll make up for it, I promise. The reception that followed was small and warm, held in the great hall Adrian remembered from countless uncomfortable family dinners, though tonight it felt different entirely, filled with genuine laughter rather than careful performance. Margaret sat near the head table, watching the celebration with an expression of quiet contentment that Adrian had rarely seen on his grandmother's face, and when their eyes met across the room, she raised her glass toward him in a small, private toast. Later that evening, once most of the guests had departed and the great hall had grown quiet again, Adrian found Elena standing alone in the old library, her wedding dress trailing softly against the wooden floor as she ran her fingers along the spines of the books she had spent so many months cataloging. I thought I might find you here, he said, joining her by the shelves. It felt right, she said. This is where it all started, after all. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin against her shoulder as they both looked out over the room that had changed the course of both their lives. My grandmother mentioned turning this room into something more than an archive, a proper library again, open to the public a few days a week, as part of the family's historical foundation. She told me the same thing, Elena said, smiling. She suggested I might oversee it, if I wanted. Do you want to? I think I'd like that very much. She turned in his arms to face him, her expression soft in the lamplight, the same warm glow that had illuminated the room the very first night they met. It seems fitting, doesn't it? That the place where we found each other becomes a place where other people can come find pieces of their own history too. Adrian smiled, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. My grandmother rejected 12 brides before you walked into my life without even trying. I wasn't trying to walk into anything, Elena reminded him. I was just trying to catalog old letters and avoid the notice of the family who employed me. And instead, you ended up married to the head of that family. Life has a strange sense of humor sometimes. Outside the library windows, snow continued to fall gently over the estate grounds, blanketing the gardens where they had exchanged their vows only hours earlier. And inside, surrounded by the same books and letters that had first brought them together, Adrian and Elena stood quietly in each other's arms, no longer strangers hiding behind careful walls, but two people who had found, in the most unexpected of places, exactly where they belonged. The old library, once forgotten and locked away, had become something new entirely. Not just a room full of dusty secrets and buried history, but the beginning of a story neither of them could have written on their own, one that would carry forward into whatever came next, together.